𝗪𝗂𝗂𝗀𝗡.
In the beginning of Christianity, they were not. If you go to early church fathers like Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Marcion, they were all quite clear that in the Bible, by which I mean the Old Testament, Hebrew canon, they were very clear that among the stories of that canon were stories of other kinds of entities that really merited a serious study, and those stories shouldn't be read at face value as God's stories. So that belief was part of the mainstream of Christianity in the beginning. Many of those church fathers were highly influenced by Plato, and Plato was a proponent of paleocontact. He argued that not only did we have contact in the deep past, but that we were genetically altered through contact with other species. These early church fathers had no problem with that at all. However, unfortunately, votes went the wrong way in the first 3 or 4 centuries, and a lot of those church fathers were pushed to the margins, and it became a taboo right up until 2009. When from out of the blue, the Roman Catholic Church convened a colloquium. This was a symposium of top theologians and academics and scholars to discuss the theological implications of contact with other civilizations. And when they did that, you could have knocked me down with a feather, because only 400 years ago, they were burning people at the stake for merely suggesting there might be intelligent life on other planets. Benedict XVI and his administration were expecting some other authority to make a disclosure. And they wanted to get on the front foot and say, look, there's no issue here. There's no problem. It just means the Creator's been busier than we thought, and we've got more brothers and sisters than we thought we did. That was sort of the short version of what the spokespeople for the Curious said when they stepped forward after the symposium. They wanted to prepare people for statements coming from somewhere else, and then there were no statements coming from anywhere else. So I think they'd anticipated something that hadn't happened, and then everything went quiet again. And now it's quite hard to go back and find the interviews with people like José Gabriel Funes, the director of the Vatican's observatory, or 𝗪𝗂𝗪𝗂𝗀𝗀, the senior astronomer, or Corrado Balducci, Vatican senior advisor in paranormal ministry. They all made really far-reaching statements about ET contact, which you could read in 2009, now a bit harder to find. Any authority, whether we're talking about the Pentagon or the Roman Catholic Church, is a community of people with a spectrum of ideas and opinions as to what the right way forward is. So clearly right now, there's a big push and pull going on within the military intelligence community in the USA as to how much disclosure should be allowed. There are people like Thomas Monheim, the Inspector General of the intelligence community, who is leaning towards more disclosure. And it's really thanks to him that we had the July 26th hearing with the David Grush complaint in view, and we had those 3 experts, David Fravor, Ryan Graves, and David Grush, speaking to the Congressional House subcommittee hearing. There are people clearly wanting more information to reach the public than in the past. And then there are others, such as Arrow's previous leader, who've wanted to push back and say, no, we need to keep this quiet. And in fact, we don't even want information about the program, the reverse engineering program, to be shared from unit to unit within the military intelligence community, let alone briefing Congress, let alone briefing the public. So people like Chris Mellon have done what they can to push the conversation forward. We're out of the era of death threats, so that the physicists involved in the reverse engineering program, people like Jacques Vallée, Gary Nolan, can speak to the press. Or James Lukatsky can speak to the press and say, this is the work we've been doing, this is the materials we have, this is what we're investigating. Whereas when I was a boy at school, if they'd tried to do that, it would have been quietly suicided. This is something I know about because I lived in 𝗪𝗓𝗰𝗀𝗀𝗃, Buckinghamshire in the UK. This was at the time of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars initiative, the SDI initiative. And clearly, the questions around that was, what is that program about? Is that about having weapons in space where we can sort of attack our enemies on Earth? Or are we defending ourselves against an attack from off-planet? Because that seemed to be the impression the president had created. And I lived close to this top secret research facility working on that program, and 25 people involved in that program committed suicide over quite a short period. And the families refused to believe these were suicides. And I think it may have been 𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗃, the union leader, called for a public inquiry into these suicides because he said it's statistically impossible that they were all suicides. And Margaret Thatcher said, oh no, we've had a look at it and there's nothing wrong. So that's what I grew up with. And now all of a sudden you've got Jacques Vallée, Gary Nolan briefing the press, Lou Elizondo briefing the press, Chris Mellon speaking freely. You've got 𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗃, the former chief of space security for Israel, stepping up to the microphone and saying Israel and the States are in contact, and they have been for more than 7 decades. A decade ago, it was the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev on an open mic saying we're in contact. Every new prime minister of Russia is given a dossier detailing the spacefaring communities that we are already in contact with. He wasn't debunked. He wasn't sacked. We didn't have Putin going on camera and saying the prime minister had a few too many vodkas and I distanced myself from. Nothing like that. So there's been a massive, massive shift, and there is far more now in the public domain than I could even have imagined a decade ago. Meanwhile, in the churches, it's still a taboo. And I think for a lot of people, it's still a topic that you bring it up, and it's just something to be ridiculed, laughed at. We're still in an era where people experience close encounters don't feel free to mention it to anybody because they don't expect to be taken seriously. So it's quite a cocktail of things going on at the moment, and I think public are really having to race to catch up. In my studies, I found an incredible overlap among those stories. And the gist of the overlap is this, that life in the cosmos is the norm rather than the exception. This is the theory of panspermia, held to by people as authoritative as Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix of DNA. He argued the timelines for our planet are not long enough for life as we know it to have originated here, to have come here from somewhere else. And many of our ancestral stories say exactly the same thing. Go to the Zulu story of 𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗃, it says the same. In the Bible, it's the same. The Mayan story of the 𝗪𝗂𝗪𝗂𝗪, it's the same. Go to Plato, he says the same. And so the idea is that whenever the genetic coding for biological, conscious, intelligent life lands in an hospitable environment, that's a planet with water, essentially, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones we're familiar with on planet Earth. And then there are places that develop life sooner, and the species there are more advanced, reach a technological age sooner. And then very often they will visit and intervene in the stories on other planets. And according to the texts I've studied, that's exactly what happened here. The genetic coding landed on our planet, started generating forms of life, and then at many points we have been visited by other forms of life who have tweaked what they found here. Just as we have fine-tuned the cat we breed and eat and the dogs that we breed and live with, there's been some interventions here. The Sumerian story is that there was a long time when our human ancestors were governed by non-human beings. And then you have the crossover king Gilgamesh, who is part human, part sky people. And then after that, you've got the human kings and queens. So that sort of spells it out really clearly that the sky people want to keep their hands on the reins some. They're just not going to go home and let things go to chaos. It's a little bit like, I think, what we do when we invade each other's countries, where we go in and initially we have to be there with visible force. We have to overpower the country with our military and with our navy. But once you've set up the legal system and you've set the commodity prices and the exchange rates, you can begin saying, appoint your own police. Now we've written the laws, appoint your own judges, appoint your own school teachers, and then after a while you can go home. Because if you've set all those prices and exchange rate mechanisms, you can go home and still enjoy sitting at the top of the economic tree. All the diamonds and gold are still going to come your way, so on and so forth. And so you don't have to have any visible presence at all. You don't even have to control the general elections. You will still benefit. And so it would be entirely possible for a scenario like that. And yet, you look at royal history, and the desire to keep royal bloodlines pure is as alive today as it was thousands of years ago when Gilgamesh became king. I mean, when I was a boy, I read the story of the princess and the pea. I don't know if you know that, but the whole idea of that story is that a prince can only marry a princess. And the girl has to prove she's a princess. Can't marry a commoner. And that's really still the case today. Now, some people might listen and say, oh, hold on just a minute. Harry married Meghan. She's not a royal. She's not part of a royal bloodline, is she? Actually, yes. And there's been some very interesting studies done on the succession of US presidents. And the argument has been made that the successful candidate, there may be a couple of exceptions to this by now, but the successful candidate is always the one who's got the stronger bloodline connection to the European royal families. Well, that's a little bit suspicious in a democracy, isn't it? Many people have seen a photograph from the early 20th century where there are, I think it's 9 crowned heads of state of independent European countries who all think they're independent countries, and yet you're actually looking at a single family. They are all the descendants or relatives through marriage of John William Friezo. How is that possible? So keeping bloodlines pure and undiluted means something in royal circles. Now, it may be as simple as there's a handful of families who have power and they don't want that diluted. But you put that alongside the stories of the handover from E.T. to human kings, I think there's something there. You can find it in African story as well. The story of the Oba handing over to the Ojisu. You'll hear that from the Yoruba and the Edo people. It's the same thing. E.T. kings hand over to human kings, but it has to be the right human kings. And as I mentioned earlier in the Bible, you've got Yahweh who gets forced to hand over the chains of office to a human successor, to Saul. But you read the stories that follow, and he's still defining foreign policy for as long as there's still monarchy among the Hebrew people. So I think that's a long answer to your short question. But yes, I think the influences are still there. I think that we've not been left entirely on our own. And there's a reason the families who run things want to keep power. There's an amazing book, Who Runs Britain? Friends in High Places, by Jeremy Paxman. Now, Jeremy Paxman worked for the BBC for 25 years. He was the front man for Newsnight, the top news program in Britain, really. And he pointed out that in Great Britain, after 500 years of Reformation, revolutions, civil wars, labor movements, world wars, political reforms, it's still the same 5 families running the country who ran it in the 1500s. So the persistence of old powers is something to be wondered at. I take encouragement from a story in the Bible in 1 Samuel 8, which goes back to this period where we were absolutely overwhelmed by the power of more advanced beings who had colonized our planet. Yahweh was just one of a number of Elohim, powerful beings governing over humans. And yet we reach 1 Samuel chapter 8, where the indigenous leaders, the tribal elders, come together and they say, we're going to confront Yahweh and we're going to tell him we're not going to work for him anymore. No more beef, lamb, virgin girls and gold for him. We're going to have a human leader for human society. Let's confront him. And they do that, and Yahweh has to surrender the top job. Now, as I say, he does slink off and start pulling strings from behind closed doors, but they do get rid of him. And when I first read that as a young evangelical Christian, I couldn't get my head around it. Why would you sack Almighty God and think a human king is going to give you a better advantage on the battlefield? Once I realized that the Yahweh stories are stories of a being, not of Almighty God, you begin evaluating the story differently. And I came to realize that that story arc is the story arc of not every dragon narrative in the world, but a whole family of dragon narratives that date from about 10,000 years ago that describe a period of social progress. Talk about the time when our ancestors had enough of working for visible, non-human elites, and they came to the point of saying, no more. We'll confront. What can they do? They can only kill us. They reached a point where terror had been overused, and they said, no more. We're going to go over to another system. And that is what happened. That is really the punchline of the dragon narrative, that when we can overcome fear and love each other more than we fear the higher ups, then we can make social progress. And that's true whether you're dealing with dragons or an autocratic human government.